Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
It's devastating. Unlike other diseases, it isn't devastating to the individual who has it. It's to the caregiver, the person who's taking care of them, the family.
The disease is Alzheimer's. Tonight we'll hear about some of the latest research and advances in care. Good evening. Newsweek magazine recently called Alzheimer's disease the cruelest of all incurable diseases, since it in effect kills its victim twice. Once when the victim's mind dies, and second when the body dies. In simplest terms, Alzheimer's disease progressively destroys the brain and a person's ability to think and to function. It affects more than 3 million Americans. 5,000 people in Idaho suffer from the disease. And as any family who has helped a victim of Alzheimer's struggle with the disease, they know it can be a tragedy that tears at the fabric of a family. And it can cost a fortune to treat and institutionalize a victim. And at this point, there is no cure. Tonight, we'll be talking to an expert on the disease, to a woman who for 3.5 years cared for her mother while she was dying of the disease, and we'll see a film excerpt, of a film recently made about Alzheimer's. We begin tonight with Dr. Murray Raskin, an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. Dr. Raskin, just what do we know about this disease and what don't we know about it?
Well, the first thing we know about it is that it is a disease and is not just normal aging. That's been one of the major advances of the last 15 to 20 years. We know it's a specific illness which affects between 3 and 4% of those persons over the age of 65 and as many as 10 to 15% of those surviving past the age of 80. We know that when we look at the brain using microscopic techniques, that there are specific areas of damage we can see in the brain which are expressed in the person's behavior by gradual, progressive loss of memory and the ability to learn new information, gradual loss of the ability to use language, and gradual loss of other intellectual and activity of daily living functions such as performing simple activities such as eating, tying one's shoe, and generally taking care of oneself.
Sometimes is it incorrect to use the term senility interchangeably with Alzheimer's?
Well, I think it is incorrect. Senility means just growing old, and I think it's a serious error to assume that this very damaging loss of memory and other intellectual function is just growing old. Most persons who grow old do not suffer from this problem, and when you compare their brain tissue to the Alzheimer's victim, in fact, they don't show the same pathologic or brain damage signs that the Alzheimer's victim shows.
Is there a growing incidence of this disease, or are we just more aware of it because we have decided that it is a disease?
Well, I think really both. I think the major interest or emphasis on the disease, because we've now become aware that so much of the cognitive and intellectual loss among persons who have this problem in later life is due to Alzheimer's disease. We must remember that the group of persons in our population over the age of 80 is the most rapidly growing segment of our population. And because this disease occurs more and more as a person gets older and older, as we have a larger group of persons in later life, we're going to see much more Alzheimer's disease.
Again, we normally think of this disease affecting people past 65 or 70, but it can affect, and I was reading today about a story about a woman in her late 40s who was suffering.
Right. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, when Dr. Alzheimer first described the disease back in 1906, he described it in a woman who was in her 50s. And for years it was felt that Alzheimer's disease only affected persons before the age of 65, and that those developing memory problems after age 65 were developing quote, hardening of the arteries, of close quote. In fact, since we've been able to look more carefully at persons who develop memory problems and other intellectual problems after age 65, we found that most of these persons are also suffering from Alzheimer's disease.
And finally, and I want to come back to some of the research questions a bit later, but there is some evidence, as I understand it, to indicate that there might be some hereditary factor involved here.
Some hereditary factor. There's much debate about this issue. Certainly having a parent who develops Alzheimer's disease before the age of 70 somewhat increases the child's risk. When I say child, I mean person growing into their 50s and 60s. But it's not terribly dramatic. For instance, if you do not have a parent with Alzheimer's disease, your chance of getting the illness eventually is perhaps 5%. If you have a parent with the illness, perhaps that increases to 10%. We're not talking about 50%, as in such other neurologic diseases as Woody-Guthrie disease, Huntington's chorea, for instance. There is some genetic influence, but it's not an overpowering clinical problem at any rate.
Well, Doctor, we'll come back in a moment. To give you a more vivid idea of the way Alzheimer's affects both its victims and those people who care for them, we have an excerpt of a film called You Are Not Alone. The film was produced by public television station WITF in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The segment examines the case of John, an Alzheimer's victim, and his wife, Jean.
8 years ago, John was enjoying his retirement from a successful career in state government. Active in his community, he was program chairman of his Rotary Club. Then Alzheimer's disease struck and began to take its toll. 4 years later, his wife, Jean, had to quit her job to take care of John. And today she realizes that she will be unable to care for him at home much longer.
Okay. You look terrific. This disease just takes its toll. You can sort of slow down the process. But you can't stop it. I mean, he has failed in the last year, the last 6 months.
Alzheimer's can begin almost casually with a slight loss of memory, perhaps forgetting a phone number or a friend's name. As memory loss becomes more profound, it becomes harder to express one's thoughts or to find one's way home from shopping. Often the personality changes. Hallucinations and strange behavior, such as pacing like a caged animal, are common. The ability to talk slips away, along with the ability to reason, to dress oneself, to control bodily functions. Mercifully, after suffering from the initial stages of the disease, when the victim is aware that something is wrong, he eventually loses the ability to worry. With no memory of the past and no anxiety about the future, it is truly an existential life. But those who care for the Alzheimer's victim carry tremendous responsibilities.
It's devastating. Unlike other diseases, it isn't devastating to the individual who has it. It's to the caregiver, the person who's taking care of them, the family.
John was in the Navy when he and Jean met and married 39 years ago. After he was mustered out of the service, they settled down and raised a family.
I think I just sailed through life. Everything went so smoothly for so long.
Shortly after John's retirement, however, there was trouble. John's personality began to change.
He became sort of paranoid, and he imagined slights, and he crossed off friends and neighbors and even family members. As he was angry with everyone, and it was very difficult to deal with. I was angry with him. I didn't know what was wrong. I think he was probably terrified at the time.
Jean one day finally recognized that John's problem was medical.
I was working, and John was in the habit of calling me at noontime at work. He was retired. He stayed home at the time. And I told him that our children were coming for Easter. And he called me, and I reminded him again that they were going to be there that afternoon. And he called me again and said, "What did you just tell me?" And he called me again and again and again. And he must have called maybe 20 or 30 times. He couldn't remember anything at all. And that day, I knew that something wasn't connecting.
Today, John's disease is known as Alzheimer's. 4 years ago, his doctor called it organic brain syndrome or senile dementia. The name of the disease for Gene isn't the most important thing. Coping with the disease is.
I think when you finally accept what has happened, it becomes easier. The key to dealing with this is accepting what's happening to you and your family.
Gene got good medical help and got John on a regular medication program to control his hyperactive behavior. And she began to look for other kinds of help.
Even though you might think of just folding up and giving up, what good would that do? You just can't do that. I think it brings out the best in people. I think I'm doing my best. But it brings out the worst in me sometimes, too. I sometimes become very angry and intolerant, frustrated, impatient, all those things. And I don't think you can help feeling that way. I think anyone who's dealing with someone that has Alzheimer's disease or anything like this needs a lot of respite time. Really tried to be very resourceful and find ways of getting away to restore myself.
The biggest help for Gene this year has been an adult daycare center at a Lutheran church.
He's in there in time to have lunch, and then he stays the afternoon. I pick him up about 4:30 or 5. That gives me the afternoon to myself. It's been a lifesaver because I don't think I could have kept John at home this past year without that. I was wearing out.
Have you seen that birdie before?
Yes, I've seen him before.
They stimulate him socially, mentally, physically, so that when he comes home from there, it's like he's put in a full day at the office.
The director of the adult daycare center, Virginia Creasy, believes that by constant repetition, Alzheimer's victims can at least retain some mental skills.
After much prodding, they will recall something. You can tell by the expression of our eyes that they are comprehending, that they did recall.
Creasy also believes that simple techniques such as scheduled trips to the bathroom and socializing with one another on their own terms can add dignity and quality to the Alzheimer victim's life.
I love you too.
I love you.
I do.
I love you.
I do.
Now you put that one in the bottom. See, you know which one to do, don't you? You know how to build these.
We've been married for almost 39 years, and that's a long time to be with someone. There have been good times and bad times, but it's hard to let go after that long.
As John has continued to fail during the past 6 months, Gene has been advised by professionals to put him in a full-time care facility. At the urging of family and friends, she has decided to place him in the Veterans Administration Hospital.
I've always wanted John to just stay at home. I finally do believe that it will be better for John. He needs more than one person to take care of him. He needs a whole team of people taking care of him.
Gene believes that this is the right decision, but it is the hardest decision of her life.
I'm going to miss him. This morning when I woke up very early, it went through my mind that I'm going to miss just hearing John breathe in the same room.
Again, that film was produced by public television station WTIF in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now let's go back briefly to Dr. Raskin. You heard Jean, the woman on that film clip, say that it's possible to slow down the process. Is it possible to slow down the process?
Well, yes and no. A person with Alzheimer's disease may have complications such as agitation, hyperactivity, hallucinations, false hearing of things or seeing of things, perhaps depression, and these secondary things can be treated and improve the person's function if all goes according to plan. On the other hand, there really, unfortunately, is no good evidence that we can slow down the progressive loss of memory, speech, and ability to care for oneself that we see in the disease. We'd like to be able to say that we can do that, and we're making some strides toward understanding the illness, which might give us hints as to how to slow it down, or maybe even someday stop it or reverse it. But at this point, we really can't slow it down.
How about the comment that the cards, the repetition of the same things over and over can cause victims to at least retain some capability?
Well, again, we are believers in the same types of activities with our patients with Alzheimer's disease. And we think it certainly improves their quality of life to undergo this treatment, and while they're receiving it, they seem to be in better spirits and more interactive. Whether it preserves actual function is not clear and deserves more study.
Let me just ask you finally, it seems to a layman like me, and I'm sure to many people who have intimate knowledge of the effects of this disease, it seems like a particularly hopeless situation. Is it?
Well, it's not all hopeless. I think that for the individual with Alzheimer's disease and for the family, we certainly can't offer treatments, but 10 years ago we didn't even know that we were dealing with a specific disease, and then when we knew we were dealing with one, we had no idea what was going on in the brain. Today we know that there are specific chemical and pathologic abnormalities in the brain which are offering us avenues for productive research, which hopefully will bear fruit in the not too distant future.
We'll come back, Doctor. Thank you. We turn now to Kelly Sorensen, a resident of Rigby, Idaho. As I mentioned earlier, she had, until her mother died of Alzheimer's in August of this year, cared for her for more than 3 years. Mrs. Sorensen is president of an Alzheimer's support group that serves part of eastern Idaho. She joins us tonight in Pocatello. I am sure that you saw in that piece of videotape some things that were that certainly you could identify with. Am I correct?
Quite a few.
Yes. I know that, tell me a little bit about your experience in the length of time that you cared for your mother.
Well, I took care of her for almost 3 years. To begin with, I took care of her on a daily basis and would go home at night. And a little over a year ago, we sold our home and moved in with my mother and father, and she became a total care patient by then, and it took a 36-hour day to take care of her, and it was just a very frustrating, long year.
I saw you quoted recently in the Post-Register, the Idaho Falls newspaper, as saying that it really did sort of consume your entire life caring for her.
Yeah, you become very isolated. I think people are a little bit afraid of the disease, and your friends and sometimes people's families kind of forget you're around, and they don't want to have to deal with the disease themselves, and you get pretty lonely.
I saw you again quoted in that same article as saying that your major fear was that she would not recognize you when she died, and she didn't.
No, she didn't. She didn't recognize anybody. She responded to my father for a long, long time, and probably the last 3 months of her life, she didn't know him either. The day she passed away, she told me she loved me, but she didn't know who I was. Anyway, as far as we know, she didn't know who I was.
It obviously is of particular stress to a family like yours, to you and to your family. How did that, I guess, how did that show itself?
Oh, in a lot of ways. We were a pretty close family, and we probably didn't have as much trouble as some families do. We supported each other and spent a lot of time talking about Mom and the disease, and we worked together, but it consumes your life. You don't have much time to spend actively as a family. You live the life of an Alzheimer's patient, and you just kind of lose your life.
You decided, obviously, to care for her at home. Was that a decision that you had to make or a decision that you chose to make?
Probably not one that I had to make. I felt like that was something I wanted to do. My father and my husband left the choice up to me, and I'm really glad now that I did. I think it did me a lot of good to spend that time with Mom, even though she might not have known who we were.
This might seem like a foolish question, but let me ask you why you have decided to speak out on this and to sort of share what obviously must be your grief and your trouble over it.
People don't know enough about the disease, and I think the public needs to be educated. The families of the victims live in a world all of their own, and until somebody learns what the disease is like and what those families go through, those families are going to be alone, except for the support groups, which I think help a great deal. And I think people need to know that you can get through it.
Well, let me ask you about your support group, and I should mention at the end of the program we're going to put up some telephone numbers and names for people who might have additional questions or might need some help. These groups, several of these groups around the state. Tell me about what your group does, for example.
We hold monthly meetings. Some are specialized meetings where we have people come in and discuss the disease and learn a little bit more about the disease, and then we just have an open discussion with the members, and it gives them a chance to talk to somebody else that knows what they're going through. And I think that's really important. You can't just talk to anybody and know that they're going to understand unless they've been through it themselves.
Sure. Well, let me go back to Dr. Raskin here for just a moment. How important is this idea of family education and these kinds of support groups that she explained?
Yeah, in my opinion, the support groups are more important in the treatment program than the doctors, nurses, and other health professionals at the present time over the long haul. I wish we as medical professionals had more to offer specifically for the Alzheimer's victims, but in the care of my patients, I lean heavily on the resources of the support groups.
And they're obviously growing rapidly across the country in terms of numbers.
Absolutely. We're talking about a disease which affects numbers of people in the million category. This is not a small number of people. And that means that millions of family members are involved. And it is a terrible tragedy and burden for the families. I wanted to make one reference to the film. I think although in many cases the Alzheimer's victim may be oblivious to the terrible problem from which he or she is suffering, certainly some of our Alzheimer's victims are aware and do subjectively feel the intense discomfort and pain and distress of the illness. So I don't want to leave the impression that all Alzheimer's patients are in fact happy,
oblivious to what they're
and
going
oblivious
through.
to us. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
How about this question, I'd like to put it to both of you, about the in-home care for these patients as opposed to the institutional care. You heard Mrs. Sorensen say she took care of her mother at home, and obviously the woman on the videotape eventually got to the point where her husband had to be institutionalized. There is some difference of opinion about just what is best for both the victim and the victim of the victim, I guess.
Right. Well, if I can start. I think both situations are correct. It really depends on the individual Alzheimer's victim and the family. How many resources does the family have, both emotionally and financially, and how much of a problem from a care point of view is the specific Alzheimer's victim. We have some younger men Alzheimer's victims who are very deteriorated intellectually, but are physically much stronger than their spouses. In this situation, when the Alzheimer's victim is up at all hours of the night and the spouse is not getting any sleep, the care is very difficult. There are some situations in which the patient is somewhat easier and the resources are somewhat broader. So I think that it sounds like both approaches to care in these two individual situations showed how how a good, dedicated family can make the best of the situation.
Mr. Sorensen, I would take it that your support groups in no small way help people make this decision about just how to care for an Alzheimer's patient. Am I correct? I mean, I would assume that would be a very difficult decision to decide to institutionalize someone.
I'm sure it is. I didn't have to go through that decision, but we've had a few members that had to make the decision to put their family member in a nursing home. I would never myself tell anyone that they should keep them at home. That's a decision they have to make. And if they need our help trying to make that decision, we'd be glad to offer them any kind of help, and hopefully we can.
Right. Let me finally, in the couple of minutes that remain, raise one final question. I saw a figure today, Mrs. Sorensen, of $26 billion a year nationwide in nursing costs for Alzheimer's patients. The cost must be astounding.
It can, it's a lot of money that a lot of families have to end up selling their homes and doing a lot of things that leaves them without anything to take care of an Alzheimer's patient. There isn't a lot of outside help financially, and you know, a round figure might be $1,300 a month, and that's just for basic care. If they need any extra care, it's a lot more.
Dr. Raskin, a lot of insurance plans don't cover it. Medicaid and Medicare in some cases don't cover it.
Right.
Many cases don't cover it.
Right. Most situations, in fact, are not covered unless the family becomes impoverished and is eligible for Medicaid. You know, I should mention again that the film showed the patient being admitted to the Veterans Administration Hospital, and I'm supported, both my research and clinical work is supported full-time for the Veterans Administration. I think the agency has been very supportive of work with Alzheimer's disease, but that's also a limited resource.
Sure.
There are just so many beds in the Veterans Administration dedicated to patients for long-term care of Alzheimer's disease, and the nation really has to make some hard decisions as to resource allocation for this disease.
Well, just in 15 seconds, do you think that this has been overlooked as a matter of public policy in terms of deciding where to allocate resources?
Oh, absolutely. I think even there's actually been some prejudice against the disease. And as we're becoming more aware of the neurologic basis for it, and as more families are becoming politically active, if you will, we're seeing improvement in that area.
Well, Dr. Raskin, we appreciate your joining us tonight. Thank you, sir,
thank
very
you.
much. Mrs. Sorensen and Pocatello, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Good luck to you. That's our time for tonight. I'm Mark Johnson. Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.